The night they signed the marriage papers meant to ruin him, Texas was burning along the horizon with a grass fire nobody in Sabine County thought one woman could turn, and Cordelia Banks rode straight into the smoke with a wet blanket and a plan, while the men who'd arranged her like a curse stood frozen at the fence line. If this story moves you, do me a kindness before we go any further. Subscribe to the channel, follow it all the way to the end because the part that will stay with you comes late, and leave the name of your town down in the comments so we can all watch together how far this story travels. Now let me carry you back to where it truly began, to a hard, bright morning some weeks before that fire, when Cordelia Banks stepped down off a hired wagon at the gate of a failing ranch, and not one soul there expected her to last the season, least of all the men who'd brought her. She was a big woman, and she'd been big her whole life, broad through the shoulders, and full and strong in a way the world had only ever called too much. She was 39 that spring, and she'd been hearing the same words since she was a girl too large for the school bench. Too big, too dark, too plain-made. No man's going to take all that to wife, and no fine place is going to want it underfoot. Cordelia had folded those words up small a long time ago and put them somewhere they couldn't reach her face, because she'd learned young that a still face was the one thing nobody could take from her by force. So she stepped down at the gate of the Caldwell Ranch, with her face calm and her eyes moving, reading the land the way most folks read a letter. The overgrazed flats, where somebody had run too many head too long. The silted tank, where the good water was choking on its own mud. The cattle gone gaunt and wormy, because nobody had moved them off the sour ground. Land talked, all of it, all the time. Most folks just never learned the language. Cordelia had learned it on her grandmother's hardscrabble place, in the years after freedom came. The hard way, with nobody to thank for the teaching but her own two hands, and a lifetime of paying attention. The marriage had been arranged, but not as a kindness, and Cordelia had known that going in. The Caldwell Ranch was held in a tangle. Old Roy Caldwell dead a year, his son Eli running what was left, and a clause in the old man's will that said the ranch could only stay in Caldwell hands if Eli took a wife inside 2 years, or else it passed to Roy's brother, a soft, smiling banker named Vernon Caldwell, who held the mortgage and wanted the land and the water rights under it more than he'd ever wanted kin. Vernon had found the loophole, and he'd thought himself clever. He would choose the bride himself, and he would choose one he was sure no Caldwell would ever truly keep, one the county would mock, one that would satisfy the will's letter while shaming Eli into selling out and slinking off. He'd gone looking for a woman he believed was a guaranteed ruin, and word of a black widow keeping books and breaking horses 2 counties over had reached him, and he had smiled and thought, that one will do it. He had arranged Cordelia Banks the way a man arranges a stick of dynamite, certain she would blow the whole thing down. He had not troubled himself to learn the first true thing about her. That would prove to be the great mistake of Vernon Caldwell's smiling life. Eli Caldwell met the wagon at the gate, and he stopped when he saw her, and he looked at her, the long, quiet way a careful man looks at weather on the move. He was a tall, sun-dark, rope-lean man somewhere past 40, grey starting at his temples, and he moved slow and deliberate the way men do who've learned hurry breaks things. He did not look at her the way his uncle had plainly expected him to, with disgust or shame. He looked at her hands first, broad, scarred, a horsewoman's hands, then her seat on the wagon, the easy balance of someone who'd worked stock, then her face. "You'll be the woman my uncle sent," he said. His voice was low and even, and held no cruelty in it, only a deep tiredness. "I am," Cordelia said. "Banks. Cordelia Banks. And I know exactly what your uncle sent me to be." Eli was quiet a moment. "And what's that?" "A joke," she said. "Plain. That you'd be too proud to live with, so you'd sell and run, and he'd have the land and the water both. I figured it out on the ride in." Then she looked past him at the gaunt cattle on the sour flats and said, "Though if I'm to be a joke, I'd start by moving those steers off that overgrazed ground today, before you lose more weight off them than you can afford. They're eating dirt and worms out there. There's better grass going to waste in your river bottoms. You've got fenced off for no reason I can see." Eli Caldwell went very still. Then he came one slow step closer, and for the first time, something moved behind his tired eyes. "Say that again," he said. She was right about the cattle, and she was right about the bottoms, and by the time the sun went down, they'd moved the worst of the herd onto good grass for the first time in a year. Eli didn't say much. She was learning he never said much, that he'd poured all his words into a grief and a weariness he didn't know how to set down, but he rode beside her, and he watched, and he listened to a woman tell him about his own land, and he did not flinch from it. That was the first thing Cordelia filed away, in the careful place where she kept the things that mattered. The marriage they spoke of plainly that first night, sitting at opposite ends of the long table, in the dim house. "I won't hold you to anything the will doesn't require," Eli said. "Paper's paper. You'll have your own room, and your own say, and a fair share if you stay, and no claim on you if you go." And Cordelia, who had braced her whole life to be used and discarded, looked at this strange, tired, honest man, and understood that whatever Vernon had intended, the man across the table was not in on the cruelty, and that alone was nearly enough to unsteady her. "Then I'll stay through the season," she said, "and I'll earn my share, and we'll see." She did not say what she'd already decided, riding in past those river bottoms and that choked tank, that this ruined ranch could be made into something, that the bones of it were good, that it only wanted somebody who could read it, and somebody too stubborn to quit, and that Cordelia Banks had spent 39 years becoming exactly those two things. There was a child on the place, a girl of 10 named Lucy, Eli's late sister's child, orphaned and passed to him the winter before, and mostly raising herself in the corners of the big quiet house. She was a watchful, near-silent thing, who studied every face, like she was deciding which would hurt her first, and Cordelia knew that girl the moment she saw her, knew her in her bones, because she had been that girl. So she didn't push. She worked where Lucy could watch, and she left a horehound candy on the porch rail, where the girl would find it, and she talked low to the horses while she gentled them, so Lucy could listen without the danger of being looked at. Slow, the way you gentle anything that's been hurt, she let the girl come to her. And the old hand who ran what was left of the crew, a flint-faced, one-eyed veteran named Gideon, who'd worked Caldwell cattle 30 years, and made no secret he thought a woman, and a black woman at that, had no business giving orders. He took longer. He grunted at her, and turned his shoulder, and waited for her to fail. But he watched. And the morning he saw her rope and throw and doctor a screwed worm-struck steer that 2 of his young hands couldn't hold, he spat in the dust and said nothing, which from Gideon was the beginning of respect. The trouble had a name, and the name was Vernon Caldwell, and he came calling Cordelia's second week in a fine buggy with a matched team, a soft, heavy man with a gold watch chain and a smile that sat on his face like something set there with a trowel. He'd come, plainly, to enjoy the ruin he'd arranged, to see his nephew shamed, and the bride humiliated, and the whole thing tipping toward the sale he wanted. He climbed down and looked around the ranch the way a man looks at property he's already counting, and when his eyes found Cordelia at the corral, his trowel smile widened. "Well, Eli," he called, warm as a parlor stove, "I see my gift arrived. I do hope she's not too much for you to manage." He laughed gently, like it was kindness, and he looked Cordelia up and down, loud enough to be heard, "though I'd wager she's too much of most things." Cordelia looked at him with her level eyes and her still face, and gave him exactly nothing, not a flush, not a flinch, because she'd met 100 Vernon Caldwells, and long ago stopped paying men like him the toll of a reaction. But she filed him away whole, every honeyed, poisoned word, because she had already understood the thing it would take the men around her weeks to see. Vernon hadn't sent her to ruin the ranch only out of spite. He'd done it because he needed the Caldwell land and its water to come to him cheap and clean. And there was a reason in his books, that he needed it badly, And soon, and a man, that desperate to seem casual, was a man with something to hide. What Vernon could not have guessed was that Cordelia Banks could read a ledger the way she read a pasture. She'd kept books for a black church, and then a cattle buyer, and then a freight concern across 15 years, until the freight man's new partner decided a woman of her size and color at the desk was bad for business, and numbers had never once in her life laughed at her or called her too much. So when she set herself to understanding the Caldwell Ranch's true position, the mortgage Vernon held, the cattle accounts, the water rights tied to the deed, she found, inside a few evenings at the dead father's desk in the long gold light, the whole shape of the trap. Vernon had over-leveraged himself badly, buying up land all over Sabine County on borrowed money, and his whole house of cards depended on getting the Caldwell water rights to sell to the railroad that was coming through. A sale worth a fortune, but only if he held clear title before the railroad men arrived in the fall. The marriage clause was his clean path: shame Eli into selling, take the land for the mortgage debt, deliver the water to the railroad, and cover all his other reckless paper before it came due. It was timed to the season. It was timed, Cordelia saw, to the very week the railroad survey was expected. And the one thing that could break it was a Caldwell marriage that held and a ranch that didn't fail. Cordelia sat very still with that knowledge under her broad, scarred hands, and then she went to find Eli, because some things a body does, just because it's plain right. He didn't want to believe the whole of it. Not because she was a woman, and not for how she was made. She'd give him that always, that he never once doubted her figures for those reasons, but because Vernon was his father's brother, his own blood, and Eli Caldwell was a man who held on to the idea of family well past the point it served him, because family was one of the few things the grief hadn't taken. "He's my uncle," Eli said, quiet, the way he got quiet when something cut deep. "He's a man who sent you a wife he picked to break you," Cordelia said, gentle but plain. "And he did it because he needs your water to cover debts that'll bury him if the railroad sale falls through. I can show you in what I've reconstructed of his position, but my figures alone won't be enough against a man who owns the bank. We'll need his own books, his real ledger, to prove how deep he's in and how bad he needs this." She laid it out at the long table, plain and slow, and from the stairs where she thought no one could see her, the girl Lucy listened to every word. She told Eli they'd go careful and quiet, give nothing away, let Vernon keep believing the marriage was the curse he meant it to be, and the ranch the easy dying thing he took it for. And meanwhile, they would make that ranch live. And Eli Caldwell looked at this woman his uncle had sent to destroy him, who was instead saving him, and he said the thing that mattered more than all the rest. He said, "All right, Cordelia," her first name, in his low, even voice, and she felt it land somewhere the old armor didn't reach. The weeks that followed were the building weeks, and Cordelia knew enough of her own life to know that good never lasted, and was only the breath drawn before the next hard thing. She dredged the silted tank, and the good water came clear, and the cattle's eyes brightened on it. She rotated the herd off the sour flats, and let the grass come back, and she culled the wormy stock and bred the rest to a tougher line, and she opened the fenced river bottoms that should never have been closed. She kept the books true, and she watched the calendar and the railroad's slow approach. Gideon, the one-eyed old hand, came around inch by grudging inch, until the day he watched her face down a rattlesnake-spooked remuda and bring 8 panicked horses back to calm, with nothing but her voice and her steady hands, and he took off his hat to her, which the crew swore he hadn't done for a living soul in 30 years, and said in a voice like gravel, "I was wrong about you, and I've been wrong about a lot, and I'm too old to keep being a fool about either. I'm sorry." Cordelia just nodded, because she knew what those words cost a man like Gideon, and she filed them in the careful place. And the girl Lucy talked now, in a rush, and trailed Cordelia everywhere, and one gold evening leaned against her big arm on the porch step, and asked in a small voice whether Cordelia was going to leave like everybody always left. And Cordelia put her arm around that child and said, "I don't leave places that need me, Lucy." and this place needs me. So, and she felt something crack open in her chest she'd kept shut near 40 years. Then the fire came. It came on a dry, roaring afternoon out of the west. A grass fire jumping the county road, a wall of smoke and flame running straight for the Caldwell Range, and the herd Cordelia had spent weeks bringing back to health. And the men froze, the way men do, Eli and Gideon and the young hands staring at a thing too big to fight. But Cordelia didn't freeze. She'd read the land for weeks, and she knew it now better than men who'd been born on it, knew where the old dry creek bed cut a natural break, and where a backfire set right would starve the wildfire of grass before it reached the stock. She hollered the men out of their fright and put them to work, wet blankets and shovels, and a backfire lit just so along the creek bed, and she rode straight into the smoke herself to turn the herd down a draw to safety, her face black with soot and her lungs raw, and for 2 hours she fought the Texas sky and bent it to her will. When the wind shifted at dusk and the fire died against the burned break she'd made, the herd was safe, every head, and the house and the barn stood, and the men looked at the big soot-streaked woman swaying on her feet and understood they were alive and solvent because of her. It was that same night, by the embers, that Eli Caldwell first took her hand on purpose, just held it a moment in his rough one, and said, "Lo, I don't know what I did to deserve you walking through my gate, but I thank God for whatever it was. First touch. It landed where nothing had landed in years." But Vernon Caldwell had not grown rich by letting drowning men learn to swim, and word reached him that the curse he'd sent was raising the ranch instead of ruining it. The herd fat, the water clear, the marriage holding, the books in order, the whole scheme tipping the wrong way with the railroad men due in weeks. So Vernon did what men like Vernon always do. He went after what he took to be the soft spot. He started in town, soft and grieved and reasonable, a word here and a word there, that his poor nephew had been saddled with a black woman who'd surely bewitched or swindled him, that it was a disgrace before God and decent society, that an orphaned white girl oughtn't be raised by such a creature, all of it the way Vernon said everything, with a sorrowing shake of the head, as concern, as kindness. The talk went through Sabine County like fire through dry grass, and it found its way to Mrs. Augusta Mayhew, who ran the church society and the school and the settled opinion of every respectable woman in the county, and who drove out to the Caldwell place one hot afternoon to tell Cordelia Banks to her still and level face exactly what the decent people had decided she was. Augusta Mayhew was not a wicked woman. Cordelia saw that plain, even standing in the yard taking the sharp edge of it, because Cordelia had spent a lifetime learning to tell wicked from wounded, and what stood before her, in its stiff black silk, with its trembling righteous chin, was a frightened soul who had buried a daughter and a husband both, and had nothing left to hold to but the rules, because the rules were the last thing in her shrinking world that hadn't betrayed her. So Cordelia didn't fight her. She let the woman say her whole piece, disgrace and propriety, and what people were saying, and then, in the quiet after, Cordelia said only, "Your girl that you lost, was she near grown, or still small, when she went?" Augusta Mayhew went white to the lips. How could you presume to? "Because I know the look of a woman who sat up the nights she couldn't save somebody," Cordelia said, gentle as she'd ever said anything to a living soul. "I'm not here to take a child from anybody, Mrs. Mayhew. I'm here because there was a girl in this house with nobody sitting up her nights, and now there's somebody. You think whatever you have to think of me to get through your day. But don't you carry a lie that I'd do that child the smallest harm, because you and I both know to the bone what it costs to lose one, and I will not have you laying my name down beside your grief." Augusta Mayhew turned and left without one more word, but she did not drive straight home. She sat a long while at the end of the lane, and Cordelia, watching from the porch, understood that something had moved in the woman that would not move back. The reckoning came the day the railroad men rode into Sabine County, the way Cordelia had known in her bones it would, in town, in front of everyone. Vernon had gathered it all to a head. The railroad agents come to buy water rights. The county assembled to see the deals struck. And Vernon presiding from the steps of his bank, ready to present clear title to the Caldwell water as his own. On the strength of a mortgage he meant to foreclose that very day on a nephew he'd shamed, and a marriage he was sure had failed. He stood up before the gathered county and the railroad men and said, warm and loud so all could hear, "Gentlemen, the Caldwell water is as good as mine. My nephew's affairs are in ruin. The note is due, and I'll be delivering you clear title within the week." And Cordelia Banks stepped up out of the crowd, in a good dress made by her own hands, and said, in a voice that carried clean across the whole dusty square, "Before you buy water from this man, gentlemen, you'd best hear whose water it is, and what shape his own affairs are in. All of it. Out loud. She had Vernon's own ledger. She'd gotten it 3 nights before. Not stolen, but handed over, by Gideon of all people, who had a cousin clerking in Vernon's bank, and who'd decided an old fool's penance was to make himself useful to the woman he'd doubted. And Cordelia had sat at the dead father's desk in the long gold light, and gone through that ledger line by line, and now she read it out to the square, plain and slow as scripture read to children. The note on the Caldwell ranch, current, every payment met, because she had made the ranch pay. The water rights, tied to the deed, and the deed in Eli's name, clear and unencumbered, no matter what Vernon claimed. And then Vernon's own position, the reckless paper all over the county, the loans against loans, the whole tottering house of cards that needed the railroad money by fall, or it would bury him. "You didn't send me here to give your nephew a wife," Cordelia said. And she'd gone quiet now. She didn't need to be loud. The whole square had fallen still as held breath. "You sent me to break him, so you could take his land for the debt, and sell his water to these gentlemen, to cover your own ruin. You needed it cheap, and you needed it fast, and you bet the whole thing on a woman you were too small to bother knowing. Well, the note is paid, the deed is clear, the water is his, and your books, Vernon Caldwell, won't survive these gentlemen reading them, as plain as I just did." And Vernon, who had smiled through every word, made the one mistake men like him always make at the last. He let the smile slide off his face. He looked at the big black woman who had just laid him open before the entire county and the railroad both, and his soft features curdled into what was truly under them, and he said the ugly, contemptuous thing he actually felt, said it out loud, before he could catch it, and the whole square heard exactly what Vernon Caldwell was beneath the watch chain, and there was no smiling it back. It was Augusta Mayhew who moved first. She came out of that crowd in her stiff black silk and planted herself square beside Cordelia in the square, and she said, to Vernon, to the railroad men, to the whole staring county, and most of all to her own self, "I will witness those books. I keep the church society's accounts, and I can read a ledger as well as any man here, and I will swear to what this woman has shown us before any judge in Texas." Then One-Eyed Gideon stepped up on Cordelia's other side, hat in his hand. Then a rancher named Stoddard, whose own place Vernon held a note on, and who'd just understood how close he'd come to the same trap. Then a dozen more, until it was no longer one woman alone against the bank steps. It was the whole of Sabine County standing up at once for what was right. The railroad men, who had no wish to buy water under a clouded and fraudulent title, took their business straight to Eli Caldwell instead, and dealt with him fair and square. Vernon's tottering paper came down on his own head inside the month. His fraud laid bare by the ledger Cordelia had read in the square. And he lost the bank and his good name both. Eli Caldwell kept his ranch and his water and his father's land, and sold the railroad its right-of-way on his own honest terms, and stood in that dusty square, with his orphaned niece's hand held tight in his, and looked at the woman his uncle had sent to destroy him, who had instead saved everything, and for the first time since his father died, in front of all of Sabine County, Eli Caldwell smiled wide enough to break your heart. The ranch became something nobody had dreamed when Cordelia first stepped down at that gate. The railroad money, taken honest, bought good breeding stock and more land. land Cordelia chose by reading it the way she read everything. And the Caldwell Range grew season on season into the finest cattle operation in that part of Texas. 10,000 head, and then 20. A true empire raised up out of a ruin. And folks who'd called her a curse now rode a day's distance to ask Cordelia Banks how she'd done it. She ran the herd, and the books, and the water, and the land, and One-Eyed Gideon took her word as gospel and was glad to, and Augusta Mayhew came to Sunday dinner and taught Lucy her letters at the long table, and never spoke of propriety again, because she'd learned at last what the word was meant to mean. And Lucy grew up tall and easy in the saddle, and talked enough for 3 girls, and she called Cordelia no particular name at all, just turned to her for every single thing the way a body turns toward the sun, which was the only name that ever needed saying. Eli was a slow man, and grief had made him slower, and Cordelia had spent her whole life braced to be sent away, so the two of them came to each other the long, careful way that wary people do, through seasons of work shoulder to shoulder, through 1,000 small kindnesses, neither one ever announced. The marriage that had started as Vernon's cruel paper had become something neither of them had a word for yet, until there came an evening in the 4th autumn, the near pasture gone gold under a low sun, the two of them leaning on the fence watching the great healthy herd move like a river across land Cordelia had brought back from the dead, when Eli Caldwell said more words at one time than she'd ever heard out of him. He said he'd married once young, before the war and the grief, and had believed that part of his life was buried for good. He said he'd been wrong. He said his uncle had sent him a woman, meaning her, for a curse, and he had watched that woman read his ruined land like an open book, and turn back a wildfire with her own hands, and raise an empire out of dust, and raise up a grieving child besides, and that somewhere in all of it he'd come to understand the thing he should have seen the first day at the gate, that every quality the county had mocked in her, her bigness, her color, her too-muchness, every single thing the world had shamed her for, was the exact set of things that had saved every soul on the place. Her broad shoulders were the measure of what she could carry, and she had carried all of them. Her stubbornness was the reason she'd stayed when she'd been sent as a thing to be thrown away, and he did not want 1 ounce of her made different. "I'm not asking you to be mine, because my father's will says a Caldwell needs a wife," he said, slow and plain, the long gold light running across both their faces. "That paper meant to use you, and I'd sooner burn it than let it. I watched a man try to own this whole county, and I'd sooner lie down in the ground than be the likes of him. I'm asking if you'll stay, on terms that are yours. Your name on the deed beside mine because you earned every acre of it. Your name on the brand because the empire is yours as much as mine. The girl already believes the morning comes because you call it up. Stay because you choose it, Cordelia, not because my uncle, nor my father's will, nor any soul on this earth left you no other door." And Cordelia Banks, who had been arranged like a curse and sent like a stick of dynamite to blow a good man's life apart, who had been told her whole long life that she was too big and too dark and too much for any good thing to ever want her, who had folded 10,000 cruel words up small and carried them across half of Texas, stood in the long gold light beside a quiet, decent man on land she had built into an empire with her own 2 hands, and she felt the old armor come loose all the way at last and slip down off her broad, strong shoulders, and she found that she did not need it any more. She was not too much. She was not too little. She was exactly, finally, and for the first time in her whole life, enough. She thought of the gate, and the wagon, and the men who'd watched her ride into the smoke. She thought of every word ever thrown at her, like a stone. And then she let all of it go, the way you let go of a weight you no longer have to carry, and she turned to Eli Caldwell, in the gold light, and gave him the only answer that had ever been true, the answer she'd been riding toward her whole hard life, without once knowing the road led here. "Yes," she said. "Just that, yes."